Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for March 25th, 2022. And on this episode, I'm talking about how supporters of the monster state use constitutionality, or even just the word unconstitutional, as a tool to ensure that they continue on a state and local level doing full enforcement of all federal gun control, past, present, and future, all of which, of course, we would call unconstitutional in the first place, but they're using it as a weapon against us. I've got some great examples on this, most prominently from Tennessee back in 2015, but another one that I want to talk about from Wyoming just this week. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You're going to find everything you need to follow the show, all the archives. I've got in individual episodes, specific blog posts for each individual episode where you're going to find all the different platforms, video, audio-only podcast platforms. You'll find a section with links and references that I talk about so you can read and learn more in context on your own time, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. The show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 15-ish minutes. We'll see. And we want to first go back to February of 2015, where in Tennessee, Senate Bill 1110 and House Bill 1341 were filed by State Senator Richard Briggs and Representative Terry Lynn Weaver. I've got a link to the archive. You can read the full text. Here's a highlight. This is a really clean, straightforward, solid bill as introduced. It says, on or after, this is Section 1A and Section 1B, on or after July 1st, 2015, no public funds of this state or any political subdivision of this state shall be allocated to the implementation, regulation, or enforcement of any federal law, executive order, rule, or regulation regulating the ownership, use, or possession of firearms, ammunition, or firearm accessories. No limitation. They just can't use any public funds whatsoever. Section 1B has the same prohibition on the use of personnel or property for the enforcement or implementation of any federal gun control measure, past, present, or future. Now, I did an episode, I've talked about this many times in many episodes, but I think the best one on this that I did earlier this year, banning state and local enforcement or assistance in the enforcement of federal gun control is one of the 4 essential steps to nullify those measures in practice and effect. I will link to that episode in the show notes. I encourage you to check it out first time or again. It's really good and really important info. Anyways, back to Tennessee. Along the way, the Thin Blue Line learned that they were going to be fully banned from working with what they call their federal partners. They get lots of loot from grant programs, civil asset forfeiture, and the like to help the federal government enforce federal stuff. A lot of times it is gun control. And so they made some recommendations. Of course, the Thin Blue Line politicians went along with it. And of course, their backers went along with it as well. Didn't seem to complain about it at all. And then we ended up with this. They added, in each of those 2 subsections, 1A and 1B, they added, I went to government school, so my counting isn't all that great, but I think it's 23 words to the end. They just removed the period, changed it to a comma, added 23 words that read like this, and I will read it in context again in just a moment. If the expenditure of public funds would result in the violation of another Tennessee statute, Tennessee common law, or the Constitution of Tennessee. So in context, on or after July 1st, 2015, no personnel or property of this state or any political subdivision of this state shall be allocated to the implementation, regulation, or enforcement of any federal law, executive order, rule, or regulation regulating the ownership, use, or possession of firearms, ammunition, or firearm accessories. That's where the period was now. If the use of personnel or property would result in the violation of another Tennessee statute, Tennessee common law, or the Constitution of Tennessee. So when we reported on this at the time, so instead of actually having an express clear ban on using personnel or other resources to enforce federal gun control, it had that qualifier. Now you're banned if doing so would be a violation of the state constitution. We reported on this as being a potentially positive first step. Here's how, maybe a very positive first step, something that people could use to build upon if they choose to. Signed as law, Tennessee takes first step to block federal gun control was the title of my article from May 4th, 2015. But again, instead of passing a clear express prohibition on federal gun control enforcement or use of funds from the state to do that, personnel, whatever, they passed something that says stop enforcing if it violates the state constitution. But it didn't say who was going to make that determination and how does that play out in practice today. It's the courts. It's the law enforcement, doesn't it? I'll get to that in just a moment. It wasn't going to be a ban on that enforcement unless people took further action. And that's how I put it in the article. In practice, the new law will have a significant impact on these. I was talking about some proposals at the time and any similar federal gun control measures or proposals in Tennessee should the people take action to ensure it's followed. However, inside sources we were talking to, and we do still to this day, to a lot of people, suggest that leadership in Tennessee law enforcement has no intention of changing how they currently work with what they refer to as their federal partners. Scott Landreth, who we miss a great deal, was doing a lot of great volunteer work with us back at the time. Great guy. If you're watching, Missy Scott, hope you're doing well. Things won't change until the people use this new law to make them change. So it's a foundation for people to do something. But the result is there has been no change. Now, on the side of the people, I think that's very disappointing. That tells me that not many people in Tennessee care about the right to keep and bear arms or see all federal gun control as a violation of their natural right to keep and bear arms, the state constitution and the Constitution for the United States. Now, on the law enforcement end of things, we had already heard, we reported on it as soon as it was signed, that we were expecting law enforcement to continue full enforcement, continue partnering with the ATF and other agencies, DEA, for example, and they have not changed a single thing in the 7 years that they've been doing this. Now, even though they've all taken an oath to the Constitution for the United States, and the Constitution for the state of Tennessee, just like you and I, they're pretty much all victims of government-run schools. And government-run schools have propaganda that tell us that law enforcement, their only job is they don't pay attention to the Constitution. They just pay attention. They just enforce laws. They're not peace officers. They're law enforcement officers. They are required to follow orders. If they're told to enforce something, they don't reply with but that's unconstitutional. We shouldn't be doing this. And if you do get somebody once in a while who's uppity like that, they'll probably, if the unions keep them on the job, they'll probably just get moved to a desk job and not called for that kind of enforcement action. So we're all victims of the propaganda from the government-run school system that tells us that only the courts make a determination or can even have an opinion on what's constitutional or not. Now, if you think about how this plays out in practice, I wrote an article this week I gave it a little analogy that I thought was fun. Parents of young children understand the pitfalls of this approach. That is, stop doing this if it violates the rules, if it violates the Constitution. They know the pitfalls of this approach all too well. If you tell a 10-year-old to, quote, stop keeping your toys where you're not supposed to keep them, you might find them neatly put away that afternoon instead of strewn all over the family room floor. But if you have allowed the messiness for years, you shouldn't be surprised if nothing changes with this kind of instruction. In all likelihood, they'll keep doing what they've been doing all along. You've not given clear instruction, and they'll likely default to the status quo. But take that same situation and tell the child this. You can no longer keep your toys on the family room floor. They must be put back on the shelf where they belong. And you're going to have a much better chance of getting the results you're looking for, especially if you make it clear that breaking the new rule will result in punishment. Now, you can have that same kind of analogy and apply it to enforcing federal gun control measures as well. And I included that in my article as well. Tell law enforcement to stop enforcing any unconstitutional bump stock ban and you might find a few who no longer help the ATF do so, but it's almost certain that it won't result in a wholesale change in agency policy. But remove the word unconstitutional, and that's the word that they add in there specifically so they continue enforcing, and I'll explain why in just a moment. And there's no longer any lack of clarity. Stop enforcing any bump stock ban means just what it says. There isn't anyone that can say, well, I didn't realize that was unconstitutional. I had no idea. I didn't know there was a court that told us that we weren't allowed to enforce this. No one told me. It is an opportunity to kick the can over to somebody else. And the sad part about this, even though I think that's an interesting and maybe the kid one is kind of a fun analogy, the sad part is the reason I wrote it is because Wyoming, just this week, the governor there signed into law a very similar piece of legislation that was passed into law in 2015 in Tennessee and made no impact on federal gun control enforcement. In fact, it's made it more difficult to stop it because they're telling people, oh, okay, we've done something positive on this already. But in Wyoming, here's what Wyoming passed. The new law prohibits the state or any political subdivision of the state from using, this is SF 102 that was signed by the governor on Monday. It prohibits the state or any political subdivision of the state from using personnel or funds appropriated by the legislature of the state or any other source of funds that originated within the state to enforce, administer, or cooperate with, here's the key word, any unconstitutional act, law, treaty, executive order, rule, or regulation of the U.S. government that infringes on or impedes the free exercise of individual rights guaranteed under the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Now, we've been warning against this to activists, good guys, to politicians. None of them are good guys, but whatever. But people who are willing to maybe do the right thing once in a while on certain issues. We've been warning about this for quite some time. We've been totally ignored, as if we don't know what to do regarding a piece of 10th Amendment legislation. Totally ignored, and they included this word unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, the legislature last year had a piece of legislation very similar to the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act, which is having great impact on the ability of the ATF to partner with local law enforcement already, and it's barely getting rolling. And all 23 sheriffs wrote a letter aggressively opposing it, so it died. The same type of a legislation was changed. And there was a version of it introduced this year that I don't have a lot of details on personally, but a similar thing that would have banned them from enforcing a lot of federal gun control past, present, and future. Instead, they went with this. This was the law enforcement supported bill that included this caveat that they're banned from enforcing federal gun control if it's unconstitutional. And that was signed on Monday. Now, even worse than Tennessee. Tennessee didn't claim, and I don't think so. Tennessee didn't go out of its way to say, we are protecting you in the state from federal gun control. But they actually named the legislation in Wyoming the Second Amendment Protection Act. And here's the governor tweeting on Monday. He said, I was joined by law enforcement for the signing of the Second Amendment Protection Act. This bill was a collaborative effort that protects our residents from federal overreach and continues Wyoming's tradition of protecting Second Amendment rights. Now, the only way you can say that this is protecting people from federal overreach, from federal gun control, is if you don't understand what it is, what the law says, how it works in practice, or you're a total scammy liar. Maybe it's a little bit of both, but I'm pretty sure that the governor and a lot of the people that move this forward know exactly what's going on. Now, in Wyoming, unlike in Tennessee, there are actually penalties in the legislation in Wyoming that was signed into law for cops who violate it. And we're being told, primarily based on an article in the Cowboy State Daily during the whole process while it was moving forward, and there was some debate and pushback on this, we're being told that Wyoming prosecutors are definitely on board with prosecuting cops for enforcing federal gun control. But this is a trick. Here from the article, Wyoming prosecutors would not hesitate to press charges against police officers who violate state law, according to the president of the Wyoming County Attorneys Association. This is a guy named John Worrell or Worrell. I apologize if I got the name wrong. He put it this way. He's responding to people saying in the debate in the legislature, hey, we're going to rely on county prosecutors to prosecute their buddies who work in law enforcement. Ignoring that whole unconstitutional part for just a moment. And he's saying, no, well, what are you talking about? He says, quote, "I know of not a single county attorney in this state that isn't going to prosecute a violation of law if one is demonstrated, whoever it is that committed the violation." Okay, that sounds very kind of political. We're going to prosecute if we can prove that they violated the law, we're going to prosecute. So we're being told, oh, well, this is very positive. We're really encouraged that they're willing to say this regarding the Second Amendment Protection Act. But again, this is 1 zillion% a trick. This is a sleight of hand, and John knows exactly what he's doing. Let me read the text. Here's the penalty section in 914-203 subsection C. Any public officer who knowingly violates subsection 8A of this section is guilty of a misdemeanor punishable by imprisonment for not more than 1 year, a fine of not more than $2,000, or both. It sure sounds like, oh, okay, they're going to go after people for this. But there's a couple of issues. First of all, knowingly is a very high, a very specific, a very difficult legal standard to prosecute. Here's how I explained it in my article from earlier this week. The term knowingly is used very specifically in law. In short, prosecutors have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person charged with the crime was fully aware that their actions were a violation of the law and they did it anyway. So someone has to be aware that the law is on the books. I think all law enforcement in Wyoming knows Senate File 102 was signed into law. They're all aware of it. But how can they be prosecuted for knowingly enforcing an unconstitutional act? Here's how I put it. The only way an officer could be convicted for knowingly violating SF 102, I need some water, hold on. For violating Senate File 102 is if the Supreme Court first struck down a federal gun control measure as unconstitutional, because they have to knowingly enforce an unconstitutional act. It specifically says they're banned from enforcing any unconstitutional act. It says it in the text that was signed by the governor. So the only way an officer could be convicted is if the Supreme Court first strikes down a federal gun control measure as unconstitutional. Then prosecutors would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer knew this and continued to enforce the measure anyway. Because the act says they are banned from enforcing an unconstitutional act, law, treaty, executive order, rule, or regulation. In other words, no law enforcement officer, unless the only reason they passed this was to create a lawsuit, which is possible. Some people in the gun rights community think the only way to defend the right to keep and bear arms is through the courts. And so let's set something up so we can get somebody charged with this, and then we can get a court to tell us that this is unconstitutional, which makes it really no different than today. The act itself is not protecting anyone from federal overreach. It's just a vehicle for getting the federal courts to protect us from federal gun control. So to knowingly enforce an unconstitutional act is the only way someone's going to be charged or specifically prosecuted. I think this is an utter scam, both in Tennessee and in Wyoming. Never trust the politicians, never trust the people who enforce these federal gun control measures. And before heading out, I do want to point out that after pushing on this for a number of years, some activists got Tennessee legislators to introduce follow-up legislation, but rather than actually improving on what they passed into law in 2015, they made things far worse. One piece of legislation that got signed into law in 2021 was almost the exact same bill that was passed in 2015. So it's as if no one knows what's going on. Maybe they're dumb. Maybe they just think the general public isn't following along, and that's very possible. And then they passed another requiring. So now, instead of just saying, well, there is some chance that maybe law enforcement will stop enforcing things if they think it's unconstitutional, now they made it a law that they have to enforce all federal gun control until a court tells them it's unconstitutional. So they made it even worse. Here's how I was quoted in Mike Meharry's article. "We're not sure if these legislators just don't know what they're doing or if they're grandstanding and hope you don't know this does nothing. Either way, it's very damaging to efforts to actually protect the Second Amendment from federal attacks." Well, it's not awesome news, but it's important for us to know what they're doing. It's important for us to know their tricks, their sleight of hand, and these little things that they do in legislation. One word can change the entirety of how it works in practice and effect and turn it into absolutely nothing. I hope you found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you support what we do, you support us getting this information out there. Nothing helps us get the job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. It starts out at just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also help spread the word. Reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button on any of the video platforms, leaving comments, sharing links, all that stuff will help trigger the algorithm of the platform, primarily the mainstream ones, and tell it to show the program to more people. Again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the path to liberty.